Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. I'm State Representative Stephen Kinsey. As many of you know, the Free Library is dedicated to advancing literacy, guiding learning, and inspiring curiosity. From its award-winning author event series to its thought-provoking programs, like the recent panel discussion on the legacy of race and policing here at Parkway Central. Please visit freelibrary.org/support. So let me repeat that. That's important. Please visit freelibrary.org/support to make a gift that will help the library to continue producing such transformative programming. And while you're online, do like I did and sign up for a library card. I actually did that. Still waiting to receive it, but I did it. It's now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Ta-Nehisi Coates. Mr. Coates, oh, he's coming out, folks. Hold on one second. Let me tell you a little bit about this gentleman. All right? Mr. Coates is many things. An author, journalist, blogger. Some of you might remember this thing called comic books. He's a comic book writer, screenwriter, educator. But throughout and above them all, he has become a clarion voice in our country, calling attention to the so-called bloody heirlooms of our nation's past. His words have been searing the national consciousness for years through his work as a national correspondent for The Atlantic and his National Book Award-winning Between the World and Me, a treatise to his son about being black in America. In 2015, he was the recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, an acknowledgement of the genius of his historical, political, and personal analysis on race relationships in our country. He is also a distinguished writer in residence at NYU's Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. His new book, We Were 8 Years in Power, An American Tragedy, is a collection of new and previously published essays on the Obama presidency, and is interspersed by his own personal reflections. The Boston Globe called it essential, saying Coates' probing essay about race, politics, and history became necessary ballast for this nation's gravity-defying moment. His talk tonight will be in conversation with 6 ABC's Tamala Edwards, weekday co-anchor of Action News Morning and a regular co-host of Inside Story. We are so pleased to have them here with us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, now you guys can get ready. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Ta-Nehisi Coates and Tamala Edwards to the Free Library.
Good evening and welcome. When I met Ta-Nehisi backstage, I said, I watched another interview you did where you said they're all starting to run together. So I have done my best. We will see if I survive. But thank you for coming out. And Ta-Nehisi, the book is titled An American Tragedy. And I was telling you how much I loved the essays in between the essays, the things that you write to tell us about where you were and how you felt. And in the 4th year, you write this, and I start here because people ask you so much.
Okay, so you're already ahead of everybody else because you said in the 4th year. So that means you actually got into the book. So
I did. I read the whole book. There's a lot of underlining.
Wow, that's impressive.
But you get people ask you all the time about hope, right. And you always say that's not my job. My job is to present the information,
right.
And you decide
right.
whether or not hope is warranted. But you wrote this. All I know is that even now, with outrages compiling daily, with the suicidal wish of whiteness on full display, with its impulse to burn down the country, if the country can't dream itself white, I'm hoping that I'm wrong, that I am somehow unnecessarily bleak. Then you end the chapter, the answer was always there. The history told me, the streets told me, and so the music told me. I heard the tune, soon I would hear the lyrics. And at the end of that chapter, I wrote one word, heartbroken. To me, this book was a memoir of your broken heart, that you started, you let yourself hope, and then you were both upset. I knew it was coming, and shocked that it happened.
That's pretty good.
Are we off to an okay start?
I should interview you.
One of these days.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think because I write in this really, what feels like a really hard and direct way, I think people assume like that's how I am. But I'm actually a pretty soft dude. You know, I really am. You know, I'm pretty, sensitive, and I am. You know what I'm saying? I am. I mean, I think that's why, to the extent that the writing touches people, I think that's actually why. It doesn't seem, but it's actually my sensitivity. It's the fact that I'm in touch with the emotions that allow, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
The emotions actually to be broadcast out. In the first place, if you're that hard, you can't really write. You don't have anything to touch, to bring to other people. And so, I feel things, and I let myself feel things, and I'm not sorry about the optimism. I'm not sorry about the sadness. I'm not sorry about the disappointment. I'm not sorry about the anger. I'm not even sorry about the hatred. It's all part of being human. And so, in many ways, when I was working on the book, as you said, the interstitial pieces in between. How do you pronounce that word?
We're going to go with interstitial because it's what I said and what you said, and they can find out later if we're wrong.
It's a great word. But with the interstitial pieces, what happened was I went back and read like the early blogging I was doing when I was working on those pieces, and I read the piece, and I had all these memories coming back, and it was like looking through an old photo album, and I could see pictures of myself, and I could see myself feeling in ways that I had forgotten I actually felt, and so trying to pull all that together, to touch, all of that, and to bring it forth, was a huge component in the book. I have to say though, I didn't know it was coming. You know what I mean? Like that was like, it became apparent to me, I think as I say in the book, probably about 2012, 2013, what actually happened, because one of the privileges of having had that posting at the Atlantic, having that position at the Atlantic, is it offered me so much time to read, and to read like I hadn't read since I had been in college. And so it gave me access to knowledge in a way that I just didn't have before. You know what I mean? I just didn't have time to, take in that information and write about it and engage in that way. And once I did, certain things became clear.
A lot of people have said to me when I said I was going to talk to you, looking back, is there anything we could have done that he could have done, that
Nope.
we could have all done that would have
Nope.
changed where we are?
No, nothing. Nothing.
It was always going to be like this.
Yeah, it was. I mean, let me rephrase that though. I mean, listen, events are about probabilities and chances. You run, as somebody told me that you run the election again, Clinton versus Trump. It could have went another way. It could have went another way. All those models that folks said were wrong, well, they weren't necessarily wrong. If I say you got a 75% chance of winning, it's a 25% chance you're going to lose. And what happened, was that Clinton lost. So I don't want to say it was necessarily destined to be that Trump was going to win the presidency. What I'm much more certain of is Trump's status as the Republican nominee. And that's the actual tragedy as far as I'm concerned. Because I think you have actual data that shows that if somebody decided to latch onto the dark heart of whiteness and white supremacy, you could go pretty far. Consistently throughout Barack Obama's term, majorities or pluralities of the opposition party did not believe he was a legitimate president. Didn't even believe he was born here. That is incredible. And people kind of got used to it, and they would like laugh it off. And Barack Obama himself would laugh it off, and it's funny, look at these kooks. Even though those kooks are actually the majority of the opposition party in a two-party country. It's actually a lot of people, in fact. When Hillary Clinton said that thing about deplorables, and everybody, got upset and said, how dare she? Well, look at the data. Look at that.
You say look at the data, and people will come back and they will say some of those kooks voted for Obama twice.
Right.
How do you get here? Your father said something interesting. He just said those folks were really desperate.
They were, and he was a superior candidate. I mean, easy. I always tell that people, you can't, say that just because this man cleared the highest, most ridiculous standard that should not be there for any citizen of this country, that somehow that favors the double standard. It doesn't. He just cleared the double standard. You can't say the fact that Jackie Robinson had to conduct himself in ways that white Major League Baseball players did not, that therefore redounds to the credit and a lack of racism and the egalitarian spirit in Major League Baseball. It doesn't. It clearly doesn't. You don't get to raise the standard for me and then claim the credit for my success. And I tell people all the time, and I said this earlier this afternoon, the real test is could any black person or any woman, or I guess any non-white male, act like Donald Trump and get elected president. And it's laughable. Everybody knows that. Everyone, and so you will have equality. You will have, non-racism. You will have an anti-racist country when a black person can, and I'm not encouraging this, obviously. But when you see some black dude bragging about sexually harassing a white woman
and becoming president, you'll be in a different country then. Let's hope that's not what we need to, see that. Maybe there'll be some other things, some other standards. But as long as that's the case, I think we'll have a problem. And just one more thing about that. I think people, not my critiques of Obama, but they just forget. This is how the system works. The system says you have to be twice as good to get X, Y, and Z. And then when you're twice as good, it says, see, everything's fair. You know what I mean? But no, the very fact that you had to be twice as good to get that's the unfairness. You know what I mean? Once you accomplish, you can't say, see, everything's fair. He did get those votes. He got those votes by being a superior candidate. You write about the fact that Obama's being led to your being it created a moment where you could do your work and you could assess him, and you watched him over years. What was your original opinion, and how did it evolve to the time you got to My President Was Black?
I always thought he was really smart. I thought he was clearly very, very smart. I was impressed that somebody like that, by which I mean did not really share my necessarily my orientation or my politics, was so deeply read about black folks. He's incredibly literate. Mm-hmm. And I'm not being theoretical. I'm telling you, he's just incredibly, incredibly literate, about, black folks. And, we may come out on different ends of that reading, but I mean, people sort of wave this away now, but if I had told you, 15 years ago that there was going to be a president of the United States that talked about the influence of the autobiography of Malcolm X on his life, you would have laughed me off stage. Nobody ever thought that was going to happen. So I thought he was impressive. I had that sort of almost feeling, I think that all black folks have, whether we agree with him or not, of feeling personally well represented by his family. So much of being black in this country is the shame we end up feeling that we should not have to feel, but that we end up feeling anyway. And before Barack Obama, I'm just going to be real here. You would cut on BT, and you see some dude with 20 women, in G-strings, throwing money everywhere, pouring, champagne on the girls. You know what I'm saying? I'm a hip hop fan, right? But that's not how I would like to be represented, to the world. You know what I mean? The very fact that I have to think about that, is it in and of itself a burden. But, your representation, you cut on the movies and it's some dude, shuffling or acting crazy, and you just sort of got to, cover your face and feel like this does not represent me. This does not represent the diversity of my experience. This certainly does not represent, what I would choose to be an ambassador, for how folks, would look. And, when you saw Michelle and Barack and them two kids and that dog,
You really like to point out the two dogs. You like to
I know. The dog is important, though. The dog is important because, like, that's like the Leave It to Beaver
Yes.
sort of, Benji. You know what I'm saying? Like
Very Americana.
Very Americana. I don't even like dogs, so.
But you like Bo.
Yeah, I mean, no, actually, I don't. But by their standards,
Right.
I would never fit into that standard. I would never. I mean, people would take one look at my background and they'd be like, "It can't be you. I should not be a representative of any group of people." You know what I'm saying? But by the standard that America, makes for what they consider to be acceptable, this was like as good as it gets,
And even in the end, the last essay, well, next to last, My President Was Black, you come to him and you have a long talk, and you lay out your thesis, everything that's gone on, and he says to you, it's hard to draw a grand theory. And you say his refusal to let go of hope, that countenance is what you call it. You say, that gave me my Michelle moment. It let me be proud of being in this country. But at the same time, did you see it as a beautiful madness that even in the face of what you were saying, he couldn't go, yeah, you were right?
I didn't need him to say I was right.
But you had the data.
I did. I felt like I did. I did. I feel like if a person, who thinks like I think, and who made the conclusions about America that I have, and drew the conclusions I drew about America, that person could never be president of the United States. They just couldn't. And so it almost required a kind of, madness to actually be president. By the same token, that person necessarily would not be prepared, and maybe would not have the best analysis of the onslaught that would necessarily come. Barack Obama's analysis of it, which is, it's almost like I would love for this to be true. Like I hear him talk about the country, and it's like that's the world I would like it. The way I would like the world to be. I just don't think it is. But his analysis as well. There are some number of Americans in this country who are hardcore racist, white supremacists. But the vast majority of my enemies are deluded. By Fox News, by Rush Limbaugh, by, this complex of conservative media that just tells them, Barack's gonna take away your guns, Barack's gonna do this, gonna do that to you. And my quibble with that always was, yeah, but these people are buying something. Like they're customers. They have a need for something, and I think it kind of condescends them to pretend that they're just, somehow being brainwashed. You know what I mean? I presume these people to be, intelligent, rational human beings capable of making adult choices, and they are making an adult choice to inhale conspiracies. Why?
I wanted to ask you about the importance of ignorance. In one of as you go into the case for reparations, you talk about how it changed your life, and you are leaving a cafe, going to the train, just trying to listen to your music, and a man stops you and he says, I didn't know.
Right.
And another white man comes out of nowhere and says, I didn't know either.
Right.
What does it mean that people didn't know that they are horrified when they read your essay, and what to do with that? I had a number of white people say to me, I want him to tell me what to do to make this better. I got a resist sign in my yard. What else can I do?
I think about this interview with Malcolm X, and he was being interviewed by, God, I can't remember the guy's name. He wrote Robert Penn Warren. And Robert Penn Warren was kind of going through this political conversion, and Robert Penn Warren is saying, and he says to Malcolm X, he says, is it fair, you have a young white child who's only 3 years old, has done nothing, in the world, completely, totally innocent. Is it fair that you lambaste them with the charges of racism and et cetera that you do? Is it fair that, you use this general term about white people for this young kid who's only, 3-4 years old? And Malcolm, sharp as ever, said, well, the fate of that, and I'm paraphrasing, the fate of that young child is linked to some child in Harlem. Is it fair that that young child, who's only 3-4 years old, has to take the slings and arrows of racism, can't, escape, can't get out, has no choice about, their fate and the things that happen to them. That child is only 3 or 4 years old. As long as we're trapped, you're going to be trapped too. And I say that to say that when folks ask, they say, well, you wrote this book and it says, people who, want to be white, people believe they're white. What can I do to not be white?
Well, there are people making attempts.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. But, the way you explain it, what can you do not to be, what can I do to not be a nigger? You see? It's not up to me.
Yeah.
It's not, you're part of something. You've been trapped by something. What you can do is you can work for a world where your children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren don't have to be white. And as much as I work for a world where my children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, don't have to be niggas. But I don't have like the ability to, individually extract myself, from the situation. So, in terms of, what can be done, I think the first thing you got to do is you got to recognize that it took some 350 years plus to get you here. And so the expectation that you will do something in your relatively brief lifespan to immediately undo and give yourself absolution, which is what I think a lot of people are looking for, you have to dismiss that. You have to, accept that this is the work of generations. This is a struggle of generations. It's not supposed to happen, right now. You can do something, but you got to do things because you believe in doing the right thing, not because, you think, this kind of absolution is going to come to you in your lifetime.
When I was a kid, white supremacy was something I heard my father and my uncles talking about in the evening light as they would drink and smoke.
Right.
I didn't hear it outside of the circle of black folks talking. The word white supremacy is being used in the White House briefing room on a regular basis.
Yeah, I heard George Bush use it the other day.
Does this say something to you?
He denounced white supremacy. I was like, George Bush denounced white supremacy.
Does it say something to you that there was a time when it was just something that black folks talked about, but now it's being embraced as, we got to talk about this?
Yeah. And I think it's an accurate depiction. I think it sticks because it's quite accurate, and I think what happened, this is like tied to Obama. One of the arguments I make in the book is the very fact of Obama allowed for people like myself and a number of, just a lot of other black writers, William Jelani Cobb, the New Yorker, and Nicole Hannah-Jones, at the Times, to really, look at race in this kind of critical way. And one of the things that had happened even before, we got the chance to, do it popularly, is there had been all of this scholarly work done at universities, at say a Temple, at say a UPenn, at a Howard, at a Morehouse, where folks have really, dug into, the archives and had given us a wealth of information that we could then use when the time came and there was an opening to, go out and say X, Y, and Z. And so when we use the term white supremacy, we have scholarship behind it. We aren't inventing things ourselves. We aren't, making rhetorical points. We are referring to a systemic bias that has been in this country since colonial times, and has persisted up into, this very day. And so you can outline it. You can say to somebody that, there were 4 million, in 1860, African Americans enslaved in this country, that they constituted large numbers of, the Southern population, that they were crucial to the economy of the South. And you can talk about, you trace that line up through Jim Crow. And you can talk about the plunder of Jim Crow and stripping people of the right to vote and stripping people of the right to have any sort of, conversation or any sort of say in how their tax dollars were spent, erecting, public universities, public schools, public libraries, public pools on the tax dollars of black people and not giving them access to those facilities. You can talk about how, when Jim Crow, at least, on its face, seemed to be broken, suddenly you see the appearance of a carceral state out of seemingly nowhere. So that, the United States of America in 1970 had a, prison population roughly on par with the rest of, the Western world, something on the order of 150, 200 per 100,000 people incarcerated. And suddenly, for merely by coincidence, as some people would put it, or not by coincidence, as other people would put it, at the end of the civil rights movement, that, population, suddenly shoots up. And for some reason, it's focused on black people. Why would that be? Why would that be? Why is it that, in the midst of a drug crisis right now in this country, folks are filled with compassion and talking about a national epidemic and, how we need to, be so compassionate, in the midst of this opioid crisis. But, there are a lot of us who are older who remember the crack epidemic. This was not the answer. Compassion was not the jail was the answer. You know what I mean? Crack babies. Demonization. That's right. Demonization of black families, demonization of black women, black mothers. That was the answer that we got. And so when you see that kind of persistent bias and how it has effects across a long period of time, well, then you got to name that thing. You got to say that that's something, and we say that that thing is white supremacy. And that it's with us today. It's not a rhetorical gambit. It's evidenced. It's a very, very real thing that we have, as they say, the receipts to prove.
I also wanted to ask you about blacks pushing certain things away. When I read The Case for Reparations and talked to people about it, it was the same sort of idea. This was the first time everything was in a place, and you could see the pictures, so much of I didn't know.
Right.
And it reminded me of going to my grandmother's oldest sister and trying to talk to her about what it was like. And she refused to talk about it. She didn't want to.
Right.
And it feels like the import of that, not wanting to talk about it, not knowing. You wrote a whole essay on why don't blacks know about the Civil War. What is that piece of this in here?
Well, I think, God, I would have changed the title of that essay if I could have redone it. There's a lot of stuff I would have changed in that book, obviously, that I talk about. It's true. I mean, that's what half the book is about, what I would have changed. And it's important to write about what you would have changed. It's important not to present yourself as though you are some all-knowing, flawless prophet. You're human, so you're flawed. What was the question again? Sorry. I remember. I got it. I'm okay. I got it. I remember.
You wrote a piece about we don't want to know about the Civil War.
I got it. Okay, I'm sorry.
And when you wrote about reparations, I was like, I didn't know.
I'm sorry about that. But you did. I mean, we all kind of knew.
No. When I hear about the GI Bill, I think about my father's uncles talking about the VA. I don't think about you weren't included originally. I think about my aunts and uncles talking about their mortgage, not you couldn't have got one originally.
But you must, on some, respect, when you heard that, some part of you must have known that probably didn't go the same for us as it went for them during the period.
But when you laid it out, I was like, I didn't realize how.
Right. But see, that right there, that's a large part of my work. It is that what black people feel to be true, I just try to, again, go find the receipts for. Because what I've found is that feeling, even if it sounds crazy, is probably correct. That because of, not because of anything, genetic or anything like that, but just because of the conditions of our lives. And I think this is probably true of any group of people, when you are in a kind of place where somebody with power is doing something, you have an apprehension of things. You have an apprehension of power in the world. And so when I was a kid, I can remember, my dad would take me, places and folks would yell out, they say, this country was built on slavery, and you would hear that and you would say, what does that mean? What does that specifically mean? You know what I mean? And then I went off to college and I said, well, maybe things are more complicated. Maybe it's not this, maybe it's not that. And then you see, the country actually is built on slavery. And there's, plenty of evidence, to say that. And so it's the same thing for Case for Reparations. Black people know they've been ripped off. They know they owed. They know people have been robbing them since the moment they got it. They're very, very clear on that. Now, they may not, put it together in the way that I put it together. They may not have, all the evidence, proof, data, but the instinct, the sense that something is wrong, that you're looking at me like I haven't been robbed, like you haven't robbed me, but I know you robbed me. I know it, and I know you know it. You know what I mean? So my job is just to, sort of put the case together, to say, no, you definitely got robbed. It's not even a debate,
People ask you a lot about hope, but when your work comes out, it's an event. People post it on Facebook. They go back and forth. They work through it together. But I wonder, you're the first reader. You're in your apartment by yourself, putting together the data, and it's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
What do you cry? Do you scream? How do you work through? You don't have a bunch of people on to go through it with together.
I tend to get angry a lot. I tend to get really, really angry. I've been telling this story. I'll tell a different one because I always talk about Clyde Ross. There's an essay in that book called "Black Family Age of Mass Incarceration," and one of the things I really wanted to deal with is people always talk about nonviolent drug offenders and their place in the carceral system. But in fact, if you look at the state system, a lot of the numbers, like if we actually want to do something about decarceration in this country, you have to confront the fact of violent crime. And what I find is people often want to take on the easiest arguments, like the kid that got busted for having weed. But I wanted to take on the argument of, no, the guy who robbed somebody and had a gun and put it at somebody's head, he's actually being in jail too long too. I wanted to take on the much harder argument because, in fact, if you look at other societies, they do not send, like if you get busted for that, in France, in Germany, they actually don't send people away the way we send people away. There is something really, really different about what America does, even with quote unquote violent crime. And I went into the home of this family in Baltimore, and it was the mother, the dude's brother, and his sister, and they talked to me about how they had grown up in Emerson Village in Baltimore, and how when the gentleman's name was Odell, when he was 4 years old, he ate paint chips and got lead poisoning. And it totally altered like his intellectual capabilities. At that point, a number of families were suing Baltimore City over lead poisoning. Not at the point when he was 4 years old, but at the point I was reporting the story. And one of the big lawyers that was handling the case told me 90% of the families who came in there were black. So Odell does not, his mind was not, obviously was impaired by that fact. He grows up, he ends up sticking up a cab driver, goes to jail, but is given life with the possibility of parole. Is a model prisoner for 20 years, actually has a job on the outside, and they would not let this dude out of prison. He did his time, obviously was, completely, reformed, a system which had wronged him from jump. Was steadily, continually wronging him. He had family support. His brother had actually been a correctional officer, in Maryland State Correctional, and he knew the system and understood it. And he was fearing, for his brother. I sat with his mom. Mom told me how she just feared that she was going to pass before her son got out of jail. And I left there and I was just shaking. And when I encounter those stories, as I must for the work I do, I just try to convey all of that feeling to you. That's like what I'm doing, in that apartment when I'm alone. I try to take those stories and all of the emotion and all of the heart that I feel. I try to just, put it into the words and, give it to folks and make folks feel what I feel,
You started out with quite a presence blogging and on Twitter. You don't do it as much, but John Kelly got you back on Twitter this week. And you had a running theme. Here are 5 books to know. Here's a fact. You don't know because you don't want to know. You could Google it and know it in 20 minutes.
People, man.
And you've made the point.
There's so much pretense.
You've been to military institutions, and I've heard you talk about them. The best, the brightest. If it's a lie, it can't stand. Mm-hmm. What does it mean? Not everybody else they're filtering what they want. John Kelly's supposed to be at a different standard. When you heard him say it, knowing that military tradition, what did it tell you?
It's infuriating. The thing that I think you're referring to is I went up to West Point. I got invited up to West Point earlier this year. It was a great visit, and I got to address the cadets. They had, read between the world and me, and they were reading some of the work, and I just got to talk to them. And they had this. I guess I'm gonna mangle this. I'm sorry for anybody that might be a graduate of West Point in here, but they had this cadet code, and it was a cadet will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. And then on the campus, they had kind kind of milquetoast, moist monument dedicated to folks who died to the Civil War, and it was presenting, Grant and Lee like they were equal, kind of warring brothers. Now, as I said, that's your code, and I think that's a great code, to live by. But are you thinking about the lying that happens societally? Are you thinking about the lying that's happening on your campus right now? Are you tolerating that? And we had just a really, really impressive conversation. The kids were open. They were challenging. Like, they weren't just like, wow, that's great. You know what I mean? Like, they actually, came back at me, which was really, really good. And then you interact with kids like that, and you see a 4-star general who's operating in the highest offices of government in the country, who is the gatekeeper, for a man who is the most powerful person on the planet Earth, who has the nuclear codes, who claims to pledge himself to defend the country, and in some fundamental way does not actually understand that country, does not actually understand what he's defending, does not understand the dangers, does not understand the complexity of it. That is scary as hell. How are you going to protect something that you don't understand? How are you going to be an Army officer and you don't understand the Civil War? Civil War killed more Americans than Vietnam, World War I, World War II, Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, all the wars put together. More Americans died in the Civil War than all the American wars put together, and you don't understand why that war was fought? It's not hard to understand. They said it. I say this all the time, like, there are wars that are actually hard done. You want to understand why I say the 30 Years' War was fought? That's actually hard. That's actually hard. Was it religion? Was it territory? 100 Years' War, you want to say that's actually, quite hard. It went over the course of 100 years. The, causes and, everything changed over the course. World War I. These are hard, and I'm serious. Like, these are actually, difficult wars to understand what actually was going on. The people that started the Civil War said why they were starting it. I mean, literally, and they weren't vague about it. You read, as I, put in that Twitter string, Mississippi, articles of secession, they say, we are thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. None but the African can, do this labor. It's right there. The vice president of the Confederacy stood up and said, the cornerstone of our, new republic is slavery. It's not vague at all. It's not hard to understand. It's not that, unless you want to not understand. Unless you just want to be ignorant. Unless you, want to believe in Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny. Because that's what it's like. It's like believing in the Easter Bunny. It is that level of ignorance and denialism, and that a 4-star general who is the chief of staff for the United States of America is that ignorant should scare the hell out of every citizen in this country. It should scare you. You should be petrified that dude is controlling the flow of information to a dude who's even more ignorant. I mean, you talk about blind leading the blind.
But you also wonder what is to be lost. Why do you lose something to say it was about slavery? You can say it was about some other things too, but why can't we acknowledge this is what it was about? There's something fundamental there.
You know what? I think the answer is in how he treated that black woman the week before. That's the answer.
The empty barrel?
Yeah. I think the answer is his actual treatment of her. I mean, where he, if you see somebody who will come out and lie about somebody, it's an incontrovertible proof. Now, we're not talking about history. This is last week. You know what I'm saying? We got incontrovertible proof, dude, you was lying. And you can't apologize. Well, you might be susceptible to myths that, flatter your ego. You might be that kind of person. You might be the sort of person that, does not much care for truth. This guy's, I'm sorry, you got me on a rant now, but like this dude's talking about,
I think this is what people were hoping for.
Yeah, well, here you go. You got me wound up now, you got it. But I was in here talking to these kids earlier today, and the young lady, she asked me, what about, taking down these statues? How do we, might erase our history, da-da-da-da-da. I said, listen, man. When the USSR fell apart and they was taking down statues, wasn't no Americans like, don't erase your history. They cheered for it. When we invaded Iraq and they pulled down the statue of Saddam Hussein, no, nobody was like, wait. Don't erase your history. He did some great things. Nobody said that. Here you got Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was a slaveholder and not just a slave. Listen, I feel a kind of way about slavery, and maybe I'm a little biased. Okay. All right, fine. If that's what you want to say, I mean, I would, argue with that, but that's cool. That's cool. You want to say that. How are you going to be an American, a patriot, and have a statue to a dude who tried to destroy America? It's insane. It's insane. Unless your notion of what America is only applies to certain people. Then it begins to make a little more sense. I was, this woman, and, Kelly said the same thing. We're applying, today's standards, to yesterday. No, it's yesterday's standards. Mm-hmm. The enslaved black people in Virginia, in South Carolina, I'm sure they knew slavery was wrong. They had a standard too. You understand? There's no reason why I should privilege Robert E. Lee's standard of morality over the people he enslaved. In fact, I propose to do, the inverse. I think that's the, actually the more intelligent option. And so people, they just, a part of whiteness, and I don't like saying this, but part of whiteness, by which I mean the ideology of whiteness, not the genetics of having European ancestry, the ideology of whiteness, which says for some reason those genetics should be accorded some sort of importance. That predisposes you to believing in Santa Claus.
A lot of people believe in Santa Claus.
A lot of people believe in Santa Claus. They be adults believing in Santa Claus.
You're working on comics, the Black Panther series, and so I wanted to ask you about pop culture, because there are days when I wish we could just all go to Wakanda. Mm-hmm. If you are a kid, and you've got a son, I've got two sons.
Right.
It's a different, some of this is shocking when I hear some of the polling with young people. All the shows are diverse. There are a bunch of kids walking around who think Morgan Freeman is either the president or God, because he's been that way in like 12 movies. Mm-hmm. How do you have this in the pervasive culture, and yet this retrenchment that we see go down even into a younger generation?
It's a long fight. It's a long fight. And the diversity ain't where it should be. It's better. You're correct. It's better. I look at these ads, and they got women with natural hair in ads, which was something I never saw when I was a kid. You know what I mean?
The day I get off TV.
Yeah, but see, I should have interviewed you, man. It's a long fight. It's a long war, and this is a relatively recent thing. I do think that means something. I do think that you have a generation of people who Barack Obama was their first president. That's the first thing they remember. I think that means something. It don't mean the end. It don't mean the fight's over. Don't mean the fight can't go another way. But it's better than the alternative, which is to have, another, in the line of white male presidents. I will pick the alternative if given, a choice, which is what the choice was. I think that means something. It just don't mean the end of struggle.
One of the things that I've often thought about when I think about slavery is men looking out into a field and seeing children they know are theirs, that will be sold, that will work, that will never leave bondage, or men knowing there's a child on the other side of town, and I care not for what happens to it. And I was thinking about this in the context of two men who've been in the news. John Boehner had a great time in Politico, saying whatever he wanted to say.
Right.
Most people may not realize his grandson is black. John McCain.
You got dreadlocks, too.
Yeah, his son-in-law.
It's hilarious.
Interesting Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
John McCain.
Have you seen those pictures?
Yes. It was not what he was expecting.
It's hilarious. It's hilarious.
John McCain, who's been in the news, telling it like it is, he's going to have black grandchildren one day. And it always hits me when I'm in the store and you'll see an older white couple and you look down in the cart and you say, there's a lot going on here. But that in itself, the claiming of these children, that at the end of Reconstruction, nobody would have claimed that black child.
Right.
We're worried about going into another Reconstruction, but there are a lot of white folks and white folks in power who literally have skin in the game. Does that put us in a different place?
I don't think so.
Those black grandchildren would just be left back out there.
No, I don't think so. I think the problem is not individuals. The problem is systemic. And I think to some extent you're right, but it actually is a lot more complicated than that. I mean, because, there would be these white dudes who were slaveholders who had kids, and they would privilege their kids. They would do things for their kids. If you read like Frederick Douglass's autobiography, even though he doesn't say this, it becomes very clear to me that he was treated differently. It's just like he does stuff and gets away with it, not totally, but in a way that it's clear they would have sold him to like Kentucky or Tennessee, or Mississippi, and that didn't happen. In fact, I think they threaten him with it, and then they don't actually do it. The way he ultimately escapes, he tries repeatedly, and they just kind of have a much softer, I don't want to, make slavery easy, but it's clearly a softer hand than they would have had with somebody else. And so there's a history of quietly privileging, these kids, but does that mean that you're okay? Strom Thurmond claimed his kid, not publicly, but, visited with her, did things. He wasn't like, completely, that's not my kid, but Strom Thurmond was Strom Thurmond.
Doing what he was doing.
Doing what he was doing, yeah. And so I could imagine a world where, folks claim their kids publicly, and say, I love this person individually, but are perfectly happy to oppress, in some sort of broad, systemic way. So I don't know. The other piece of that is, if you accept, as I do, that race is an idea, that's not a fact, that it doesn't actually, exist in the genes, but exists in the minds of people, folks move the line all the time. And they change, who is a nigger and who is not a nigger. It's very, very malleable. And that's the history of white supremacy and racism in this country. And so individuals are capable of doing that, and systems are capable of doing that.
Van Jones has been going around the country talking about various things, and a number of people have wanted me to ask you what you think essentially about his philosophy of we can love people out of this.
Probably not. I hope he's right, but I don't think so. I haven't read his book. Maybe it's, more than that, but probably not. I don't see much. Listen, once again, in terms of some sort of representative of black people that is open-handed and is open-minded and is open-hearted, the last president of the United States is not going to get no better than that. In terms of, a gentle way of talking to white people, and, trying, yes, I see your side. I do see your side, but if only you would understand, people feel a little different over here, And what they do, they say he was a Kenyan anti-colonialist, food stamp president, who lied. That's who he was. Who loved white people or tried to love white people more than Martin Luther King? What'd they do to Martin Luther King? The highest officers, people forget this, of this country bugged him and harassed him, and then finally they shot him in the head. That's what they did. That's history. That's a real thing that actually happened. There's a long record of black people trying to love, white folks out of this. The record of white folks or people who believe that being white is important, the record of their response to that is unremarkable. There's a much lengthier record of white people or people who believe in being white when they see it's in their interest to do things for black people, when they can find some way to somehow advance themselves through doing things for black people, or when they're just up against, a hard place and feel like they have no other choice but to do things for black people, there's a history of advancement coming then. And you see that. Civil War starts out, and Lincoln is saying, listen, if I can reunite this country and not free a single black person, I will do it. It's my priority. It's only when it becomes clear that they cannot win the war without black people that they turn to emancipation. During the Civil Rights Movement, and this is the one people often think about. They think, well, love worked there. It was love. That's what happened. But they forget that it was in the shadow of World War II. It was in the shadow of the Cold War. Robert F. Kennedy, when he saw the freedom riders, he said, these folks are making us look bad internationally. We can't show the difference between ourselves, in the Soviet Union, if we see these pictures of these buses getting bombed and these, folks getting beat. You got to solve this. It was in their interest. You cannot divorce the election of Barack Obama, no matter how remarkable he is, and he is, from the fact that the country had fallen apart and was, had lost 2 wars. The economy everything was going wrong. And folks basically said, I guess we'll give a nigga a chance. That's what happened. Now, he was remarkable. But without those conditions, I don't think he would have been president. I just don't. And so, and after, he was president and tried to serve the interests of the folks that had elected him, what was the response? They went back to the most unqualified, unreconstructed person who believed himself to be white that you could find. And so, this notion that I don't see much evidence of that. You're going to have to show me, some evidence of when, in fact, forget black people. Any group of oppressed people have loved themselves out of anything. Mm-hmm. I just don't see the evidence of that.
It's, for those of you who have questions, get ready. We're about to go to the crowd. Over and over again in the book, you say, essentially, we will not move forward until there's a reckoning, until we face it. Mm-hmm. And that's where I lose hope. I just don't see it happening. Do you think we ever will? Yeah,
when it's in their interest to have a reckoning, there will be a reckoning.
When we're sitting in the mushroom cloud, we should.
Yeah, exactly. Alien invasion, what I mean? But that's usually what happens. I think what ultimately happens is when people are forced to do things, when people are forced to be moral and act in a moral manner, the morality follows. I think, the way I understand the African-American struggle in this country is, we got to fight. And generations and generations of black people in this country fight. And generations, of folks who feel like the black struggle actually is the moral struggle and is actually something they should be involved in, they fight, right along with us. And then every now and then the window opens and a broader country decides it's actually in our interest to ally with this fight. And we got to get as much as we can through that window when that happens. And then the window closes again. Right now, the window don't feel like it's particularly open. But during, I think about, during the Obama administration, people forget this. When Ferguson happened, the idea that you would go down there and investigate the police department. This was something that I don't think had happened, since the days of, Grant, when he was trying to, break the Ku Klux Klan. That the president would send Eric Holder down to Ferguson and say, figure out what's wrong with these folks. Write a report, tell me what's wrong. That was actually a thing. That was a real thing. That was an actual response to black protests. And it would not have happened if those black folks down there were not protesting. Window was open. Window's not so open right now.
Well, the window is open for asking some questions. I would imagine there are a lot of them.
I think you should do a Warren Buffett thing and sell lunch with you, and it would be amazing.
I won't have no time to write that.
I have a zillion questions, but I want to do a personal one, which is I read your first book, which was so amazing. Your father must be so incredibly proud of you. And is he still with us? And is he? And what is he saying? And then secondly, you moved to Paris for a year. And can you talk a little bit about what made you choose to do that and how it's affected how you feel being back here?
Yeah, my father is still alive. Yeah, he is proud. He is proud, especially since I was such a screw-up as a younger person. He certainly didn't see this coming. Nobody did. So I think he's very happy that he lived to see it. In fact, he says that all the time, actually. I only have to think it. What motivated to move to Paris? When Samari, my son, was born, we really wanted him to speak a second language. That was very, very important to my wife and me. And we struggled to find, we didn't have many resources at that point, so we struggled to find an environment to make that be. When my wife turned 30 years old, she had always wanted to go to Paris. She went to Paris. She tried to get me to come. I had no idea why I should go to Paris. So I didn't go. I was like, you can go. I'll stay here, take care of the kids, fine. You know what I mean? You go, have a great time. And she came back and she said, you got to go. You must go. You know what I mean? I know you think there's nothing over there for you, but you really need to go. And by that point, I was developing as a writer, and I was beginning to regret that I myself had not learned a second language, in addition to thinking about my son. So I started studying French with the notion that someday I would go and that it'd be good for a writer to know a second language. My son saw me one day working with my prof privé, as they call it, my tutor. And he said, can I do that? I said, of course you can. So we started with him. He started learning, and we paid for him to have instructions. And at a certain point, it became very clear that your language was only going to go so far if you did not throw yourself into the environment. So we went. We went for a year. We put him in a school that they told us was bilingual, but was not bilingual. It was totally French. He came home first day terrified. And one of the things is because he has had more opportunities and resources than I had as a child, I'm constantly looking for ways to make him afraid and put him in uncomfortable environments. Because that's good for you. I mean, that really is. I mean, it's good to be uncomfortable. It's good to be, because it's how you develop confidence. The feeling that I can't do X, Y, and Z, and then when you're done, it's like, oh, wow, I could. That's such an important thing to have, as a factor in your life period, as not even as a child. And so he came home. He was absolutely terrified. He said, you told me this was bilingual. I said, I'm sorry, But I'm going to tell you something. In about 3 months, you're going to be thanking me. You're going to be thanking me. You're going to feel like you could do anything, And that's basically what happened. We enjoyed it. We loved it. It was very interesting to be in a place where, as an African American, not as a black person, period, but as an African American, they regard you as American first. That's the first thing they see. You speak your bad French, and they, are very clear that you're American. That was interesting. I love food. I love wine. I love cheese. I love bread. So I had a ball. I had a blast. I love the culture over there. As I say all the time, I do not necessarily love the politics. But I love the culture of the South too, and I do not necessarily love the politics down South. I think it's important to be in touch with that. There are very few countries I could imagine going to where I would say I would love the politics. I immediately find whatever the outside was and find myself there. But even in struggle, I think it's important to be in touch with yourself and the things that you love and that you like to do.
So kind of half asking this on behalf of my students at Temple. So we read your piece, The Case for Reparations, in our unit on segregation and desegregation. And we talked about South Africa and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So you talk about that, we won't have healing in our country till we have some kind of reckoning. And I guess I wonder what you think of, so the reckoning that they tried to have in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is that something that we can have here in the United States? Is that a realistic possibility? And to the extent in South Africa, was that a real chance at reckoning? And
see, I always thought that, like in South Africa, there's some debate about how effective that actually was. I don't know that everybody feels like that's the direction we should go in. I think what needs to happen in this country is, what I try to do in the case for how do you say that word? Thank you. Sorry. I've been talking so much, y'all. In the case for reparations, I'm about to say reconstruction. The case for reparations, I try to document a very, very specific abuse and tie it to something. And I think that's probably the way forward. I don't think it's the case where there'll be a national bill or judgment, made by a judge, black folks are owed X trillion dollars. I think you would chronicle these abuses and you would make very, very clear, that folks need, folks owe, and they should, do something about it. I don't think that's actually that hard to do. I think from carceral policy to housing policy to education policy to the role of higher education, in this country, I actually think this country is more racist than people think. I mean that in the most specific terms. For instance, in Chicago, where they have an affordable housing program, and they tend to dump all the affordable housing in black neighborhoods. Why? Why is that happening? Why do we have to, bear, a kind of burden that the rest of the city does not bear? There are policies like that all across the country, that I think would make very strong cases, because then what you probably would find is you would tie that to some sort of history and find these folks have been abusive in their housing policy, for long periods of time, and so I think it's more in the case by case. And I think at that point you would begin to see some sort of consensus. People would see, oh, this is happening, around the country. But I think there are a lot of, promising outlets for that.
Ta-Nehisi, you've written about how whiteness is like an amulet, a talisman. So I wanted to know, how do you respond to other black people who think that those statements give whiteness power?
Those statements give whiteness power. I don't think I got to give whiteness any power. I don't, it's hard to understand that. It's like somebody's punching you and you're on the ground and you say, you're punching me. And you say the very fact that you acknowledge that this person is punching you, you're giving the punch power. But you're punching me. Like that's where the power is coming from. And so I've read that. I don't know what it means. Like I literally don't. You know, power to do what? What happens? You know, like what's the act? So when I say as an amulet and a talisman, for instance, in the first white president, I connect that to very specific things. I do not just say whiteness is an amulet and talisman. Good night, everyone. You know, I say that, for instance, in this very, very specific case, it allowed a gentleman, you know, who was a failed businessman, you know, who had inherited millions of dollars from his father, who would not be in business if not for that fact, who made his first appearance in the public record discriminating against black folks, who called for the death penalty for some young men who just happened to be black and Latino in New York, who were found innocent, continued to call for the death penalty for those folks, mocked the first black president of the United States, you know, as not a citizen of this country, with no evidence at all. When the evidence was actually produced, his birth certificate said, I wanted to see his grades. He can't be that smart. Who on the record, said that he don't want black folks out counting his money. Who has testimonies in his casinos of black people saying Donald Trump discriminated, didn't want black people out front as a face. Who, when asked about a case that was being brought against him, said, well, this person can't hear my case because his words, not mine, he's a Mexican. Who leered at, and as far as I'm concerned, sexually harassed the first woman candidate of a major party in this country's history, who bragged about sexual harassment on tape. Now, I'm tasked with identifying and conveying the force, the power, which would allow a person like that, with that record, which is undisputed. This is not, you know, me sort of just making stuff up. It's clear. It's clear. That would allow that person to have access to the nuclear launch codes of this country. And in my language, I use the word talisman, amulet. You can get hung up on that if you want, but what you need to do is debate the actual facts that were in that piece. You tell me, you know, that it is my use of the word amulet or talisman that allowed that to happen. I mean, I guess that's an argument, but I don't really see it as much of one. I think, you know, as you know, I was saying, there are a lot of people that play games in this country. They play games, you know what I mean? And they don't really want to do the work. They don't want to actually confront the evidence. And so they say, well, I ain't like how that sentence sounded. Okay. All right, that's fine. You know, I am charged with explaining things, you know, as they are. I'm charged with analyzing things as they are, you know. And this, you know, I don't like, you know, the way that word is or that gives it power. But that's not an actual engagement with the evidence. You know what I'm saying? You tell me, what is that power or not? That's the real question. If you can have a record like that and rise that far, is that power or not? It looks like power to me. You know what I mean? And the notion that naming the power, that actually saying that this is racism, saying that this is white supremacy, saying this is white supremacy, however you want to put it, is the actual insult, is the tool of racists and white supremacists in this country that has been used for God knows how long. You go back to the Civil War, man. You can find these folks who are making war against America, to raise a republic in slavery, talking about how the North proposes to make slaves of them. I'm not making this up. This happened. This happened. You can go back to, you know, the segregationists in the 1960s, claiming that the North is imposing on them, telling them how to deal with their problems while they keep their foot, you know, on the necks of black folks. The offense is being done to them. And so here I come, I make my writing, and you say, I'm the problem. Because I'm identifying something. I'm the problem. It's a very, very old tool. You know, my trust is that the readers, you know, who interact with it are smart enough to know the difference.
first of all, thank you for being you. Thank you for your voice. I resonated with so much that you shared tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. I mean that. Especially the part about hip-hop. Love hip-hop and certainly have some concerns there. Question, especially right after you finished the facts that you stated there. There was this mystery of the Trump voter during the campaign. And even to this day, I've not yet met in person someone who admits that they, in fact, voted for Donald Trump. I see them on TV, I see them in rallies. Have you ever met someone who said, and I'm serious, who admitted that they voted for Trump and had a conversation with you about why they did that?
Nah, but you know why? Because I was on book leave this year. But I would have. I would have. I wasn't out like reporting, you know, so I was out on leave. But I most certainly would have. You know, yeah. So it's clearly a lot of them. It's clearly a lot of them. I don't think it's hard to have that conversation.
Ta-Nehisi, thank you for being here. 4 days ago, I was in Paris to take you back to Paris. Got in a cab. There was a Filipino cab driver who said to me, why is it that African Americans see themselves as American after everything that has happened to them? But we here, people of color, in Paris, in France, we see ourselves as Filipino or African. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, sure, pretty easily. African Americans are the, you know, next to the indigenous people of this country, you know, the oldest population of Americans here. I used to feel, I probably would have answered that and would have been like, yeah, you know, I agree with the gentleman before, but like you have to understand, like if you're in South Carolina again in 1860, if you're in Mississippi in 1860, most of the people in that state are you. You understand? Like you're the majority. You understand? You have just as much claim to that land as the, you know, as the folks, more claim to that land than the folks to that. Why would you cede your claim to them? Why is it that folks who come here in 1890, 1920, get to feel more American? You've been here. You made this thing. There would be no place for them to come to if not for you. You made the music. You made, you know, the films basically are made. I mean, you're not in an active position, but you're in a passive position, you know, in terms of the films. You made the culture. You made the food. You made the building. You literally built the buildings. No capital without you. You know, you are in the, you know, the very ground, and you're a part of it. There is no America without black people. It's like, you know, I try to describe this in Between the World and Me. It is like being in your own home, and somebody comes into your own home and kidnaps you and ties you up and does horrible. That's still your home, though. It's the fact that they have power here does not make it theirs. You understand? I mean, we're headed into this period now where, again, depending on what the line looks like, but if the, you know, color line stays as it is, well, you really are entering into a period of minority rule. I mean, that actually is how you got your president. You understand? Like the minority in this country actually voted for Donald Trump. That has broad implications. Like you have a Supreme Court justice who actually should have been the choice of the majority of people who voted, who did not get seated, and now you have somebody on the Supreme Court, you know, who, you know, was the choice of the minority. Does that mean that, you know, the country does not belong to them? No, it means that a criminal power has taken possession of the country. That was the position of black folks in South Carolina. That was the position of black folks in Mississippi. That was the position of black folks in this country. And so we feel like we're American because we got as much claim to it as anybody else. You know, and the fact that the people who have power don't accept it, just because they got power don't make it theirs. It's just they got power. It's just they have more guns than us. But that don't make it theirs. That don't make the claim right any more than if you come to my house and put a gun to my head and take the deed to my house. Do that mean that I got to give up in my heart my claim to my house? You know, there's no country without us. I don't always like that. I'm not always happy with that. I often wish my home was somewhere else. But, it is what it is. It's the fact of it. We didn't get to choose this. I would not have chosen this. I really would not have. I don't say that, with a great degree of, happiness, but that's part of family. That's part of, you know what I mean? Like, you don't get to choose all the circumstances of your life, but they are what they are.
So what do you do with the narrative that continues that we are the takers? When Harold Washington died, when he lost power in Chicago, we're taking it back. After Obama, we're taking it back, as if we always take something to be taken back. When does it become,
it was
always ours
yours.
to be shared?
It was never rightfully yours, not to have a monopoly over. It was never, and it was always assured by the fact that folks could not vote. It was always assured with guns. It was always assured with folks being robbed. It was never legitimate. The claim was never legitimate. And I think, other folks can do things to make themselves feel good about that, but we don't ever have to acknowledge that.
When you spoke about white people helping black people when it's to their advantage, I thought about a lot of these sort of diversity and inclusion efforts where folks want to make the business case of it's more advantageous to have diverse teams because you'll have higher profits, you'll make better decisions, you get more creative outcomes. And I'm wondering, to connect those two thoughts, if you have thoughts on both the morality and the effectiveness of those kinds of arguments, is that just
that's a great question.
Taking advantage?
That's a great question. The question was, what is the morality and I guess also the efficacy, of making these arguments for diversity based on more pragmatic concerns? For instance, it will boost our profits if we're more diverse. Everybody, will be better off. This, if you're at, I don't know, a school and you have an affirmative action program, it would be better for the white people who attend this school if the school is more diverse. I think that's sort of, thinking is patently true. I think that diversity, the argument of diversity, particularly in the face of, all these affirmative action challenges, really, see, reparations is the real problem. Reparations is the real, I think, like, in our hearts, we all know, again, that black people, and I'm talking specifically about black people, because I don't think these, two arguments necessarily go against each other, that black people were robbed. That the reason why you should think, more about black people, for instance, at Georgetown University, right? Like, why they have, should think a special way about black people is because when Georgetown University was dead broke, they sold black people. That's what happened. That's what happened. This is, again, more true of your more elite universities than you might think. Brown University, Brown brothers were slave traders. So they should think a specific way of, they rob black people of their very bodies in order to establish these institutions, for elite folks. I could extend this logic to public universities, University of Mississippi, where they rioted to keep James Meredith out. But that university was established in part by taxing black people. And I think there is deep discomfort with saying we should do this because we owe. And so what happens is you get into this kind of mealy mouth, soft diversity phrasing. Where, it would be nice if, we had all of the colors of the rainbow represented. I'm for all of the colors of the rainbow represented. I'm for that, but that ain't justice. That's not the conversation. That's a different conversation. You know what I mean? That's just about, being a more open person, being a more inclusive person. But that's not about why the west side of Chicago looks the way it looks. That's not about, why the neighborhood that I grew up in West Baltimore looks like. That got nothing to do with diversity. That got everything to do with being robbed. But people don't want to talk about it in that way. They don't want to say that because then you got to name who took what from who. It threatens the very foundations of a lot of institutions of our society. When I was doing the reporting for the case for reparations, people want to believe that the suburbs just sprung up. My granddad moved out here and suddenly there was Levittown. It just appeared out of nowhere. They don't want to talk about the regulations. They don't want to talk about the laws that were passed. They don't want to talk about the way black people were, and they don't want to know, and they don't want their kids to know what actually happened, the criminal basis for how so much of this stuff was established, because it's a very different conversation from diversity. Listen, argument for diversity works in and of itself. Should you have a more diverse, inclusive country in all the halls of power and institutions? Yeah, you should. You should. But not because black people were robbed. You understand? Like, that's a separate thing, and one can't be substituted for the other. This works, across the board. I got into this, during the Sanders campaign. Where folks have a conversation about, having, universal health care, having a decent minimum wage, having a basic, living income, strengthening, the societal safety net. You should do all those things. I support all of those things, but I don't support them because black people were robbed. But see, what you're trying to do is substitute one thing for the other because it's so uncomfortable to talk about the other thing. It makes it hot to talk about the other thing. So what folks want to do is they want to change the subject. And they want to bring in all of these, other, things and say, well, we can fix this through this. And you're not going to get out of it, man. At some point, you're going to have to admit that you took something, that you are actively, to this very hour, taking things from people. And so when people make arguments like that, I have no problem with it. No problem with it at all. But don't act like that's a substitute for the conversation I'm having over here.
Well, thank you for having the conversation over here with me.
Thank you.
It's been a great night.